The last thing 11-year-old Sarah Jane Potts saw on that summer afternoon in 1966 was the inside of a car she should never have entered. The last thing her family ever received was a contemptuous shrug from Sheriff Beauford Cain. But what the sheriff did next, in the quiet of his locked office, was not just an act of neglect. It was the beginning of a second, deeper crime, a conspiracy of silence designed to bury one tragedy with another, ensuring that the truth of what happened to Sarah Jane would remain a ghost for the next 40 years. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. Walter Potts, at 56, had curated a life built on the foundations of deliberate, quiet order. His home in a placid Virginia suburb was a testament to this. From a neatly manicured lawn to the alphabetized collection of history books lining the walls of his study. He was a respected high school history teacher, known for his calm, measured lectures on the Civil War and the Gilded Age, a man who spoke with a quiet passion about the importance of primary sources, of questioning the narratives written by the victors. His students saw a kind, if somewhat distant man. They could not, see the ghost that walked beside him every day, the silent, 11-year-old girl with bright, curious eyes who had been his sister. 40 years, for 4 decades, the disappearance of Sarah Jane had been the silent, organizing principle of his life, a magnetic north of sorrow around which every other aspect of his existence had oriented itself. The grief was not a memory. It was a part of his architecture, a load-bearing wall he had learned to build the rest of his life around. He was a husband to a loving wife, Helen, who understood that there was a room in her husband's heart to which she would never have a key. He was a father to 2 grown children, Michael and Jessica, who had only ever known their father as a man with a carefully guarded sadness, a man who would sometimes fall silent for long stretches, his gaze lost on some distant, unseen horizon. He had a career he was proud of, but a fundamental part of him had remained frozen in the suffocating, pine-scented heat of that 1966 North Carolina summer. The helpless fury he'd felt as a 16-year-old boy, standing powerless before the sneering indifference of Sheriff Beauford Cain, had, over the decades, cooled and compressed. The molten rage had hardened into a cold, heavy stone of resignation in his soul. He had accepted it as one accepts a chronic, incurable illness. Justice, he had concluded long ago, was a privilege, not a right, and it was not for his family. The truth of what happened to Sarah Jane was buried, as surely as the forgotten graves of the past he taught his students about. He was in his home office on a crisp autumn evening, a stack of essays on post-Reconstruction America waiting to be graded. The scent of fallen leaves drifted through the open window, a smell that always, inexplicably, took him back to those first few frantic weeks of searching for his sister, a sensory ghost that never failed to ambush him. The phone rang, its shrill cry a harsh intrusion on the quiet evening. The caller ID showed a North Carolina area code he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, weary of the inevitable fundraising calls or misdials that plagued the landline. But some faint, long-dormant instinct made him pick it up. "Is this Mr. Walter Potts?" a woman's voice asked. It was professional, cautious, with a slight southern cadence that was both familiar and distant. "Yes, this is he. My name is Amani Carter. I am the newly elected sheriff of Oak Valley County." Walter's hand tightened on the receiver, his knuckles turning white. Oak Valley, a name he hadn't willingly spoken in years. The place where his sister had been erased. "What is this about, Sheriff?" he asked, his voice flat, a carefully constructed dam holding back a lifetime of emotion. "Mr. Potts," she began, her voice softening with a note of genuine empathy, something he hadn't heard from anyone in that town's law enforcement in 4 decades. "I understand this will be difficult. We were in the process of clearing out my predecessor's old office, specifically the desk that belonged to the late Sheriff Beauford Cain." Walter's breath caught. The name, Cain, was a physical blow, a ghost more monstrous than any other. We found something, Mr. Potts," Sheriff Carter continued, her voice even. "The desk has a hidden compartment, a false bottom. Inside was a file. A missing persons file, dated 1966. For your sister, Sarah Jane. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The neatly graded history papers on his desk blurred into an indistinct wave of white and red ink. The file. The ghost file. The one his father had pleaded for. The one Sheriff Cain had insisted, with a cold, dead-eyed certainty, had never existed because there was nothing to investigate. A file. Walter repeated, the words a hoarse whisper, scraped from a throat suddenly tight with disbelief. Yes, sir, Sheriff Carter said, her voice firm now. The entire original file. And Mr. Potts, it contains a witness statement. A very credible one, it seems, that was deliberately and officially suppressed. It names a suspect. Walter sank into his office chair, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged gasp. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. 40 years. 40 years of silence, of a story with no official beginning. 40 years of carrying a ghost. And now, in a single, shattering moment, it was all broken open. The stone of resignation in his soul didn't just crack, it exploded. And through the dust and debris, a dangerous, long-forgotten flicker of hope ignited, fierce and terrifying. The ghost wasn't just a memory anymore. She had a voice. And after 40 years of being buried in the dark heart of a corrupt lawman's desk, it was screaming. I'll be there tomorrow, Walter said, his own voice sounding distant, unfamiliar, the voice of a man whose carefully ordered life had just been consumed by the past. The 8-hour drive from Virginia to Oak Valley, North Carolina, was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Walter Potts drove in a state of controlled shock, the world outside his windshield a blur of autumn colors he barely registered. With every mile marker that passed, the carefully constructed walls of his present-day life, the respected history teacher, the quiet husband and father, seemed to crumble, leaving behind the raw, 16-year-old boy who had never stopped searching for his sister. He was 16 again, standing on their sagging front porch, his own voice hoarse from screaming Sarah Jane's name into the indifferent pines. He was 16 again, watching his father, a proud, strong man, being diminished, dismissed, made to feel small by the cold-eyed contempt of Sheriff Beauford Cain. He felt the phantom weight of his mother's hand gripping his, her silent, trembling grief a burden heavier than any physical weight. He had fled Oak Valley to escape these ghosts, but now he was driving directly into their heart. Sheriff Amani Carter's office occupied the same space as Beauford Cain's had, but the atmosphere was a world away. The oppressive weight of old, unchallenged power had been replaced by a sense of quiet, focused determination. Sheriff Carter, a black woman whose very presence behind that desk was a testament to how much, and yet how little, had changed, greeted him with a firm handshake and eyes that held a deep, empathetic understanding. Thank you for making the trip so quickly, Mr. Potts, she said, gesturing to a chair opposite her large, modern desk. I know this is incredibly difficult. Between them on the desk lay the ghost file. It was a simple manila folder, its edges softened by 40 years in darkness, its tab bearing the neatly typed name that had defined Walter's life. Potts, Sarah Jane. I wanted you to see this for yourself, Sheriff Carter said, her voice low. You and your family deserved to see this 40 years ago. With a trembling hand that betrayed the calm he was trying to project, Walter reached out and opened it. The papers inside were brittle, yellowed, but perfectly preserved, a time capsule of injustice. He saw the initial missing person report his father had filed, his desperate, loving words reduced to cold, bureaucratic type. He saw crime scene photos of the pine path where Sarah Jane had last been seen, stark and lonely images that made his throat tighten. And then he saw it, the witness statement. It was from a field hand named Samuel Parrish, a man Walter vaguely remembered from his childhood, a quiet man who had worked the lands bordering the Thompson property. A man who, he would later learn, had died of a heart attack in the 1980s, taking his secret with him to the grave. The statement was clear, concise, and damning. On the afternoon Sarah Jane disappeared, Parrish, from a distance, had seen her being forced into a distinctive blue sedan by a young white man he explicitly named Richard Thompson, the teenage son of the town's wealthiest and most ruthless lumber mill owner. At the bottom of the page, in Sheriff Cain's bold, dismissive script, were the words that had sealed his sister's fate. Lead, unfounded. Witness, unreliable. No further action required. BC. Walter stared at the page, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. The rage he had suppressed for 4 decades, the cold, hard stone in his soul, began to burn with a white-hot intensity. He buried it. Walter whispered, his voice shaking with a fury that felt as fresh as it had in 1966. Cain buried the whole damn thing. He let that man walk free. Yes, Sheriff Carter said softly, her own expression hard with anger. He did. And now, 40 years later, it's our job to unbury it. The air in the office crackled with a new, shared energy. Between the newly elected black sheriff and the brother who had waited 4 decades, a silent understanding formed. A partnership forged across generations by the same long festering injustice. Walter, his mind suddenly sharp, analytical, leaned forward, pointing to a detail in his father's initial report, a detail he himself had long forgotten. The woods near Miller's Creek, my father mentioned that spot. He said Sarah Jane and her friends liked to play there. In that moment, Sheriff Carter realized Walter's memory was more than just a source of grief. It was the key to unlocking the secrets of 1966. The first step was to build a profile of the man who had lived a free, prosperous life while Walter's family disintegrated. In 1966, Richard Thompson was a privileged, arrogant teenager with a reputation for casual cruelty. In 2006, he was a 60-year-old pillar of the Oak Valley community, the respected owner of his father's mill, a man who served on boards and made generous public donations. A man who carried a 40-year-old secret. Sheriff Carter's team began the painstaking work of trying to corroborate the witness statement. They re-interviewed elderly residents of Walter's old neighborhood, people who, now feeling safe under the authority of a black sheriff, began to share old whispers, stories of Richard Thompson's blue sedan scene near the woods that day, of his known penchant for harassing black residents, stories they had been too afraid to tell Beauford Cain. Walter, meanwhile, dove into the file itself, his historian's mind searching for patterns, for overlooked details. He found it on the second page of his father's statement, a small, seemingly insignificant mention that Sarah Jane had been excited about a secret clubhouse she and her friends had been building in the woods. It was a detail the police in 1966 had completely ignored. Driven by a new, urgent goal, he got on the phone, his voice steady as he started the work of a detective, trying to track down Sarah Jane's childhood friends, women now in their early 50s, scattered across the country. He reached one of them, a woman named Beverly, now living in California. At first, her memory was hazy, but as Walter spoke, the past began to resurface. The clubhouse, she said, her voice distant with memory, then suddenly sharp with recollection. Oh my God, the clubhouse. It wasn't much, just some old boards we nailed together. It was deep in the woods on that old abandoned hunting property. Walter's blood ran cold. Which property, Beverly? It's important. The one that used to belong to the Thompson family, she said. The pieces were beginning to slam into place. Sarah Jane wasn't just walking home. She was likely heading to her secret clubhouse, a place on land owned by the very family whose son was now the prime suspect in her murder. The revelation that Sarah Jane's secret clubhouse was on old Thompson family land transformed the investigation from a historical review into an active hunt. It provided a direct, chilling link between the victim and the suspect's territory, a narrative thread that had been deliberately cut and buried 40 years ago. Walter Potts, now working side by side with Sheriff Amani Carter in a makeshift command center at the station, felt a surge of adrenaline he hadn't experienced since he was a teenager searching those same woods. This time, however, it wasn't a desperate, aimless search. It was a focused, methodical advance on a specific target. The property in question was a remote, 100-acre parcel of wooded land about a mile from where Sarah Jane was last seen. The Thompsons had owned it for generations, using it primarily for private hunting trips, a place where their influential friends could indulge in their pastimes away from prying eyes. They had sold it off in the late 1980s to a timber corporation, and had sat largely untouched since. At its center stood the dilapidated remains of an old hunting cabin. Sheriff Carter, armed with this new, credible information, easily secured a warrant to search the property. As quiet word of the reopened case and the focus on Richard Thompson began to seep through the small town, the old walls of power started to tremble. Richard Thompson, now a powerful and respected businessman, immediately lawyered up, issuing public statements through his attorney that decried the slanderous dredging up of baseless, 40-year-old rumors and the politically motivated agenda of the new sheriff. He used his influence, making quiet calls to his powerful friends in state politics and business circles, attempting to shut down the investigation before it could gain momentum. But Sheriff Carter, with the bombshell of Beauford Cain's secret file, had a shield against the political pressure. The evidence of a cover-up was undeniable. The search of the old Thompson property began on a crisp autumn morning. The air was thick with tension as forensic teams, guided by Walter and Sheriff Carter, moved through the overgrown woods. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, the silence of the pines a testament to the decades it had kept it secret. Walter, using his memory and the description from Sarah Jane's old friend Beverly, was able to locate the remains of the clubhouse. A few rotting planks of wood, half swallowed by the forest floor, and some rusted nails still embedded in the trunk of a large oak tree. It was a pathetic, heartbreaking sight, a monument to stolen childhood innocence. But it was the hunting cabin 100 yards deeper into the woods that was the focus. The cabin was a decaying husk, its roof sagging, its windows shattered, its door hanging off a single rusted hinge. As the forensic team began a meticulous sweep of the interior, Walter walked the perimeter, his historian's eye scanning for anything out of place, any anomaly in the landscape. And then he saw it. The old stone foundation of the cabin's chimney was different on one side. The mortar was a slightly different color, the stones mismatched, as if a section had been dismantled and hastily, unskillfully rebuilt. It was a subtle flaw, one that would be invisible to a casual observer, but to Walter's trained, searching eyes, it screamed of disturbance. He called Sheriff Carter over. Her team focused their attention on the chimney. A ground-penetrating radar unit was brought in. The technician moved the device slowly over the suspect area. The screen, which had been showing the steady, predictable lines of solid earth and rock, suddenly lit up, displaying a dark, rectangular anomaly, a significant disturbance in the earth directly beneath the foundation. The excavation began immediately. It was a slow, painstaking process. The forensic team worked with trowels and brushes, removing the soil layer by layer, as if performing a delicate surgery on the earth itself. Walter stood by, a silent, rigid observer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs that echoed the 40 years of waiting. Sheriff Carter stood with him, her presence a quiet, steady support. Hours later, as the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, eerie shadows through the woods, one of the technicians paused, her trowel having scraped against something solid. She brushed the dirt away carefully. First, a fragment of faded, rotted cloth, the color a dull, indeterminate brown. Then a small, worn leather shoe, its buckle still intact, impossibly preserved. And then the small, fragile, unmistakable curve of a child's bone. After 40 years buried in an unmarked, unconsecrated grave, Sarah Jane Potts had finally been found. The discovery was brutal, heartbreaking, but for Walter, it was a profound, agonizing relief. The not knowing, a torture that had defined his entire adult life, was over. He sank to his knees, the 40 years of suppressed grief finally overwhelming him in a single, racking sob that seemed to tear from the very depths of his soul. Sheriff Carter placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her own eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and grim satisfaction. They had found her. They had finally brought her home. The forensic analysis would later confirm the remains were Sarah Jane's, and that she had been the victim of a violent struggle. The case against Richard Thompson was now as solid as it could ever be. He was arrested later that day, a moment that sent a shockwave through Oak Valley's elite. That evening, Walter sat in his motel room, watching the local news. He saw the face of Richard Thompson on the screen, being led in handcuffs from his mansion. The burial of truth had failed. A ghost had risen, and it was finally, after 40 long years, demanding justice. The arrest of Richard Thompson for a 40-year-old murder shattered the carefully constructed peace of Oak Valley. The story became a local, then a statewide sensation, a chilling tale of a lost child, a corrupt sheriff, and a secret that had festered at the heart of the town's powerful elite for a generation. For Walter Potts, the arrest was just the beginning of the final, most public battle in his lifelong war for his sister's memory. The trial, which began in the spring of 2007, was a reckoning. The Oak Valley courtroom was packed every day, a starkly divided audience of black and white residents, all there to witness the unearthing of a past many had tried to forget. In the front row sat Walter, stoic and dignified, with his wife and children who had flown in to support him. Across the aisle sat Richard Thompson's family, their faces a mixture of defiance and strained denial. For the first time, the two Oak Valleys were forced to occupy the same space, listening to the same terrible truth. Richard Thompson, now 60 years old, was a portrait of arrogant denial. Flanked by a team of high-priced lawyers from the state capitol, he looked on with a cool detachment, his expression suggesting this was all a bothersome, politically motivated misunderstanding. His defense strategy was clear: attack the credibility of the 40-year-old evidence and paint the deceased Sheriff Beauford Cain as the sole villain, a corrupt lawman who may have fabricated the witness statement to frame a prominent family for his own unknown reasons. The prosecution, led by a sharp district attorney who worked closely with Sheriff Imani Carter, meticulously laid out their case. The centerpiece was the ghost file itself, its very existence a testament to the cover-up. They presented the detailed 1966 witness statement from Samuel Parrish, the field hand who had seen Sarah Jane forced into Thompson's blue sedan. They presented the forensic evidence from the excavation, Sarah Jane's remains, found on property the Thompson family had owned and frequented, a place where Richard Thompson would have felt untouchable. But their most powerful witness was Walter Potts. When Walter took the stand, a profound silence fell over the courtroom. He was no longer the angry, helpless 16-year-old boy from 1966, nor the weary, resigned 56-year-old who had first received Sheriff Carter's call. He was a man filled with a quiet, powerful dignity, a living testament to a family's enduring love and a system's profound failure. He spoke of Sarah Jane, not as a victim, but as a vibrant, curious, loving little girl. He brought her to life for the jury, describing her love for reading, her shy smile, the way she would follow him around, full of questions. He recounted, in a voice heavy with 40 years of pain, the day she disappeared, the frantic search, and the crushing, dismissive contempt they had faced from Sheriff Beauford Cain. Then, the prosecutor asked him about Richard Thompson. Walter looked directly at the man who had haunted his life for 4 decades. "I saw him," Walter said, his voice clear and steady. "I saw him driving his blue sedan recklessly through our neighborhood just days before my sister disappeared. He drove past our house, slowed down, and stared. It was a look I'll never forget. It was a look of entitlement, like he owned everything he saw. I was a 16-year-old boy. I was too scared, too intimidated to mention it back then. Who would have listened to me against him?" The defense lawyers attacked him viciously on cross-examination, trying to paint his memory as faded, his motives as revenge, his testimony as the biased grief of a brother. But Walter remained unshaken. His pain and quiet dignity were undeniable. His testimony was not just about the facts. It was about the atmosphere of fear and impunity that had allowed a crime like this to happen and to be so easily concealed. The trial forced the town to look at itself. Elderly black residents, who had once been too afraid to speak, came forward as character witnesses, telling stories of Richard Thompson's youthful arrogance and the pervasive fear of crossing powerful white families in the 1960s. The climax came when the prosecution presented a final, damning piece of evidence. During the excavation of the grave, they had found not just Sarah Jane's remains, but a small, corroded object tangled in the roots near her body. A distinctive, custom-made cufflink bearing the initial T, one that matched a photograph of Richard Thompson from his 1966 high school yearbook, proudly wearing those very cufflinks. As the small, corroded cufflink was displayed on the evidence screen, a collective gasp went through the courtroom. In that moment, the walls of silence, so carefully constructed by Beauford Cain 4 decades ago, finally came tumbling down. Richard Thompson's mask of arrogant denial finally cracked, a flicker of pure, animal panic in his eyes. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces etched with a solemn gravity that filled the tense, silent room. For Walter Potts, these final moments of waiting were a strange, surreal distillation of the last 40 years, a lifetime of anticipation and dread compressed into the space between heartbeats. He sat flanked by his wife, Helen, her hand gripping his, and his children, Michael and Jessica, who had sat through every day of the trial, their expressions a mixture of sorrow for the aunt they never knew and of fierce, protective pride for their father. He felt a profound calm settle over him. He had done his part. He had spoken for Sarah Jane, for his parents, for every family that had ever been silenced. The rest was no longer in his hands. As the foreman stood to deliver the verdict, Walter's mind, unbidden, retreated into the past. Not to the pain, but to a single, sharp memory. A flashback. The pine woods in the summer of 1966. The air is thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. 11-year-old Sarah Jane is running ahead of him on the path, her laughter echoing through the trees. She turns back, her face bright with excitement. "Hurry up, Walt," she calls. "I found a new spot for the clubhouse." He sees the distinctive blue sedan of Richard Thompson parked on the dirt road at the edge of the woods. Thompson, a teenager himself, leans against the hood, watching them with an unsettling stillness. Sarah Jane, innocent and trusting, doesn't notice him. She just sees the woods, the adventure. Walter feels a prickle of unease, a territorial warning from a 16-year-old boy's gut. "Maybe we shouldn't go that way today, Sarah Jane," he calls out. But she's already darting deeper into the trees, towards the place where their flimsy clubhouse, and a different kind of predator, waited. The memory dissolves into the blinding glare of the present. No, that's not quite right. A flashback should show Sarah Jane's own experience, her terror. Let's try again. A flashback, the inside of Richard Thompson's blue sedan, the smell of cheap vinyl, and something sour. 11-year-old Sarah Jane sits pressed against the passenger door, her small hands clenched in her lap. The friendly offer of a ride home from the older boy she vaguely knew from town had quickly turned into something terrifying. He hadn't turned towards her neighborhood. He had turned onto the old, bumpy logging road that led to his family's hunting property. "This isn't the way to my house," she says, her voice a small, trembling thing. "We're taking a shortcut," Richard Thompson says, but his smile is gone, his eyes cold and flat. He looks at her, and for the first time, she sees not an older boy, but a monster. Panic, cold and sharp, floods through her. She reaches for the door handle. It's locked. "Let me out," she says, her voice rising. "I want to go home." He just laughs, a low, ugly sound. She sees the fancy cufflink on his shirt sleeve, the one with the T on it, glinting in the slivers of sunlight that pierce the dense pine canopy. She fumbles with the window crank, trying to get it down, anything to escape the closing-in feeling of the car. He reaches over with one hand, grabbing her small wrist with a force that makes her cry out. In her desperate struggle, her fingers catch on his cufflink, pulling at it, twisting. The car bumps to a stop in front of the dark, dilapidated hunting cabin. The door opens. "We're here," he says, his voice devoid of all warmth. Sarah Jane looks from his cold eyes to the dark, silent cabin and knows, with the absolute certainty of a cornered animal, that she will never see her home again. Walter flinched as the court clerk's voice cut through his tormented reverie, pulling him back to 2007. On the charge of murder in the first degree, the clerk read, her voice clear and steady. What does the jury find? The foreman cleared his throat, his gaze briefly meeting Walter's. We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Thompson, guilty. A collective gasp went through the courtroom, followed by a wave of hushed whispers and quiet, cathartic sob from the side of the room where Sarah Jane's family and community members sat. Walter did not cry. He simply closed his eyes, a single, long-held breath escaping his lips. It was not a breath of joy, but of profound, bone-deep release. The weight he had carried his entire adult life had finally been lifted. Richard Thompson, sentenced to life in prison, showed no emotion, his face a mask of pale, arrogant disbelief. The judge, in his sentencing, delivered a scathing rebuke not just for the murder of a child, but for the 40 years of stolen peace and the cynical belief that wealth could place a man above justice. After the courtroom cleared, Walter found Sheriff Carter in the hallway. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "For believing my family. For giving her back her name." Sheriff Carter nodded, her own eyes glistening. "We righted a 40-year-old wrong today, Mr. Potts. That's a start." Walter felt no desire to cheer, only a deep, somber sense of completion. He had done it. He had cleared his family's name and given his sister's story the truth and dignity it had been denied for so long. He gave Sarah Jane a proper burial in the family plot at the local AME Zion Church, her small headstone finally taking its place next to their parents. The inscription was simple, Sarah Jane Potts, 1955 to 1966, beloved daughter and sister. Found at last. The entire community, black and white, attended the service, a town forced into a difficult, painful reckoning with its own past. The legacy of Sheriff Beauford Cain was not that of a man of order, but of a corrupt official who had betrayed his oath. The Thompson name was no longer a symbol of power, but of a dark, generational secret finally brought to light. The trials did not bring quiet to Walter Potts's life. It brought a new kind of clarity. The crushing weight of injustice he had carried for 40 years had been replaced by something unexpected, a sense of purpose forged in tragedy. He had fought for his sister's story, and in doing so, he had rediscovered a voice he thought he had lost in the summer of 1966. He didn't return to his quiet life as a history teacher in Virginia. The trial, the reckoning in Oak Valley, had reconnected him to his roots, to the struggles of the communities he had fled as a young man. He saw that his sister's story, while unique in its specifics, was a powerful echo of so many other stories of silenced voices, of mysteries left to fester in marginalized communities where justice was a commodity, not a right. With the small amount of restitution funds awarded by the state in a civil case against the Thompson estate, Walter established the Sarah Jane Potts Memorial Foundation. It was not a grand institution, but a small, grassroots organization with a simple, powerful mission to provide resources, support, and advocacy for families of missing persons of color in rural Southern communities. He wanted to ensure their cases received the attention and dedication that his own family had been denied for so long. He moved back to North Carolina, not to Oak Valley, but to a nearby city, using it as a base for his new work. He learned the intricate language of cold case files, of forensic genealogy, of media advocacy. He sat with other grieving parents in quiet church basements and cramped living rooms, not as a history teacher, but as a fellow traveler on a road of profound loss. He offered them the one thing he had so desperately lacked for 40 years, a belief that their loved one mattered, that their story deserved to be heard. His relationship with his own children deepened as they saw their father transform his pain into a force for good. They became the foundation's first volunteers, helping to build its website, to organize fundraisers, to carry on their grandfather's fight in their aunt's memory. Years later, Walter Potts, now in his 60s, is in a small, cluttered office, the walls covered with maps and the smiling photos of other lost faces, other families waiting for answers. He's on the phone with a young, newly elected sheriff from a small county a few states over, much like Imani Carter had been. He's talking to her about a 20-year-old cold case, a missing black teenager, a file that had been dismissed as a runaway. Yes, Sheriff, Walter says, his voice calm, steady, full of a hard-won wisdom. I understand the resources are limited. I've heard that before. But sometimes you just have to look in the places no one thought to look before. Sometimes the truth isn't lost. It's just been hidden. He listens for a moment, a conversation he has had dozens of times. Then a faint, determined smile touches his lips. I'll be there tomorrow, he says. The ghost of Sarah Jane Potts was finally at rest. But for her brother, Walter, her legacy had become a new beginning, a promise that no other family would have to endure 40 years of silence, that no other child's story would be so easily erased.